Hello and welcome. This is a program provided by PARG, Public Art for Racial Justice Education, Creative Lattice, that has a bunch of free resources for artist business development, and Crit Connection. I am Jack Lahav. I helped start Creative Lattice along with Ruth Lance. Ruth Lance is joining me here. Ruth, do you want to say something quick about Crit Connection?
Hi, I'm Ruth Lance, Crit Connect, and it's a networking program for artists where artists are introduced to each other monthly for one-on-one interactions, be that studio visits or resource sharing or whatever they need.
And it's a great way to stay connected and across the country. So Creative Lattice is free. Everything that Parge offers is free, and Connection has a small yearly fee for its administration. All right, so welcome to Networking for Artists. We're going to be talking about the importance of networking, basically going out and meeting people, and doing this in real life, because that is we do a lot of digital stuff, but doing it in real life is important. So going out and meeting new people is challenging, especially when you're an introverted artist. I don't know about you, Ruth, but I'm one of those introvert extroverts that turns it on um, for events, but then I get completely exhausted and need to retreat back into my hole.
I'm a little bit like that, but I probably lean more towards the introverted side um, and struggle to get out. But once I'm out, I do okay, I would say.
Yep, exactly. Yeah, we can turn it on, but it's tough, and it needs bearing in mind that it is tough. And I think so. In what we learned, we did a big networking, um, like brainstorming among the Grid Connection members. And what we came up with was the most important thing, I think, is to develop a strategy, and be prepared for the networking that you're going to do. And I think having a strategy in mind and knowing what to expect are two like extremely important things so that we don't feel overwhelmed as artists.
And
Now, yeah,
I think it's important to note that as artists, we do a lot of research, right? Like on galleries, on other artists. So in that research, you just take some notes on the people you're going to meet or the gallery you're going to go to.
yeah.
So
Yeah, knowing who's going to be at the event you're going to is a big one. I think one of the biggest things, and I talk about this a lot in most of our programming, is goals. So setting some clear goals, and simple goals for what you want to achieve is like the best way to actually achieve and not feel overwhelmed because you're going to actually succeed at something. As Ruth just said, right, we have research. So learn about the event and the attendees. Is the audience, do you want to meet a collector? Do you want to meet a curator? Do you want to meet a gallerist? Are you going to just socialize with other artists? Knowing what you're getting into is important, and then practice, rehearsing what you want to talk about. And this includes an elevator speech or an introduction. I have a list of frequently asked questions that I review before going someplace or having an opening. And they're like simple things like, what are you working on now? But Ruth, if I was going to be like, what are you working on now? Or if you were going to ask me that right now, I'd be like, I'm working on a lot of different things at once. But that's
right.
not what someone wants to hear, especially a curator.
And I also think it's important to sort of um, give yourself confidence before you go and be like, what I'm working on is great, which is hard to do because I feel like I get um, sort of nervous and I'm like, oh, nobody wants to hear about what I'm doing, you know. So you
Yeah.
kind of have to prep yourself up or prop
Yeah,
yourself up before you go.
adding into whatever my questions list, I'll probably put in an affirmation of I'm a big fan of affirmations, and I'll probably just say, what I'm working on is important, and that's it. And it sounds silly, but I think it's important to psych yourself up, as you said.
Mhm.
All right, so work on your elevator speech, frequently asked questions. I think also practicing some opening lines is important. What brought you here today? Because you're trying to think of like what do you have in common with the person, and if you're talking to someone new. So Ruth, what brought you here today? Is a great opener because most people are there for a reason. Either they know the artist or they like the work, and it gives you an entry point.
And
Um,
if you have any commonalities too, like, didn't you work with so and so, or like any sort of um, common ground is also a great place to start.
yep. So, I mean, it's a similar thing when you're like at a wedding, right? Like often one of the first things you ask is like, how do you know the bride or groom? Because you know that that's how all of you are there. So, like, how do you know the artist might be a way. And maybe they'll say, I don't know the artist, and you dive into that. And so, oh, how did you hear about the show? If you don't know the artist. Um, what's your favorite work in a show? If it's a art show, right? Um, and how long, or like, let's say you're going to an event at the local museum, you can ask, how long have you been involved with, this museum? I think those are some good opening lines. All right, at the event. Um, so at the event, I mean, I told I really like this idea of the host versus the guest mentality. So switching your mentality from guest to host, and normally a guest wants to be introduced to people, or they're going to sit there until something happens to them. Whereas a host is extremely empathetic and wants everybody there to have a good time. And so the host is going to be involved in introducing people. They're going to, right, Ruth? I mean, the
Yeah,
host does a lot more.
yeah, and I think this works great if you know a few people at the event, right?
Hmm.
And they may not know other people. So it works great if there's like maybe you have a few friends there that you can then um, you know, introduce to other people.
Yeah.
It's a little harder if you don't know anybody.
Yeah, I
If you
often will, like, if you meet that first person and you do those opening line questions and you learn a little bit about them, then you can introduce them to the next person and you become this connector. And people are also usually grateful that, when there's a connector around, because it makes them feel more at ease. And I think the important thing about being a host is to remain empathetic, right? Um, understand that everyone is feeling a little awkward, and sometimes you need to be more open and a little forceful with your introductions. Baby steps. So having small goals. I feel like whenever I used to go to openings, I always felt like there was such a FOMO of like all the potential that was there. Like I could meet the gallerist and they'll give me a solo show, or I could meet a curator, collector, and they'll want to buy some work and come to the studio. But I think having smaller goals in mind is a lot better. So like just talking to one new person or like an introvert, that's going to be really hard. So I feel like that's a really good goal.
I also think it's important to remember that networking builds on itself. So, you could talk to, you know, another artist and then that artist will introduce you to another person and that artist might introduce you to the curator. So it's not, you don't have to start with like the quote unquote most important person there, right?
Yeah.
Like you can start with anybody and then those just build on top of each other. So
Yeah. Someone was saying go for the wallflowers. So like go for the other person that looks totally awkward and like they're confused, and that might be an easier person to engage with. Um, asking the open-ended questions like how did you find out about the show is important. That's the engagement. And then I like to pretend that I'm a detective when I talk to people, because I find talking to people very hard. But if I switch into detective mode and I'm trying to figure out what makes them excited, so like if they're an artist, what are you working on? Everybody loves talking about themselves. So trying to figure out like what is the other person's um, big spark in life, I think is a good way in. Anything else on this, Ruth?
well, I think it's just important to be, on the detective point, it's just important to be interested in
Mm-hmm.
other people and listen to other people.
Yep.
Because I think it's more about people like to be listened to
Yeah.
as opposed to necessarily talk about themselves.
Yeah. 100%. You know, everybody kind of wants to talk about themselves, but it's also important to listen to what they're saying and to like sort of build off it. And like improv is another really good thing, right? Of like yes and so remembering to like to yes and the other person and to see where you can go. Like I talked to somebody that I had a really hard time engaging with, and then I found out they were interested in felting, and I knew nothing about felting, and I used it as an opportunity to learn something about felting because they were somewhat of an expert. So I was like, what materials do you use? What tools are involved? How does it work? And then it became something that was interesting for me as well. All right, so setting goals, we're going to go back to that for a minute because I think it's super important. Just how most networking events are really amorphous in what you can accomplish there. So setting simple goals like talking to one person, I will compliment the artist on their work or compliment the gallerist on the show. And you could say, I will say hi to two people that I know at the show. So if you know someone else that's going, you can make it a point to go say hi to them. Managing interactions, as we just said, like listening is so important. I also think in terms of listening, a lot of people use a trick called mimicking, where if somebody says something like like I'm into felting, you can say, "Oh, felting." So you just repeat the last word that they say, and that type of mimicking puts people at ease. It's like a psychological trick.
That's
Uh,
also a good way to remember names.
yes. And that's
Like
what we'll get into the names in a second. I think I made a slide on that, but repeating people's names is super important because I'm so bad at names. Um, Common ground. So finding common ground, looking for shared interest, remembering to take breaks. So these are more like also the introvert side, right? Like taking breaks, that it's okay to like step outside and take a deep breath. And then remembering that not everyone wants to be engaged with. So sometimes you're going to be talking to someone and they're going to be like a brick wall. So feel free to just walk away or say, "Oh, great to meet you. I'm going to go get like another water." Or "Great to meet you. I was going to go look at this painting over here."
I
Um,
mean, there's also people who don't want to talk to you,
yeah,
right? And it's not that they don't want to be engaged with, but it's just that they don't want to engage with you, which is I think that's partially like there will be some people in the room who only want to talk to like, you know, the
people they
curator or the higher people up and they,
people they find important, right? Like it
people they find important.
doesn't mean that
And
you're not important. It just means that they don't find you important, and so leave them alone.
right.
Let them do their thing, and there's plenty of other fish in the sea, as the saying goes.
And don't take it personally. I
Yes.
think that's a big thing in networking is you can't take anything personal.
Yeah, I 100% agree. Um, all right, so following up, we in our little session with Quick Connection, I asked everyone to raise their hand if they use business cards, and everybody had some sort of information that they come with. So most companies today, they can print glossy images on the smaller business cards, and then a lot of artists also carry the larger, like 6-inch postcard if you have like a bigger purse or something. And you don't force it on people, but if somebody seems interested, then you give them a card and you say, "Hey, it would be great to stay in touch." Um, and then try and collect their information. So saying, "Oh, it would be great to stay in touch." And if they don't have a business card, which a lot of people don't, you can say, "Oh, what's your Instagram?" Then be in touch that way.
Just make sure on the business cards that they haven't been in your wallet for 3 months and they're all,
Mm,
you know,
you don't
kind
want
of
to do.
mangled and gross.
Yeah, you don't want to hand someone something gross. I make a little cardboard envelope for my business cards. So like out of a hard cardboard so that they stay nice in my fanny pack because I use a fanny pack. But then I know they make business card holders, but it's important to go through that stuff ever like before you're going to the show and make sure you have nice ones. Um, Always offer things to people. I think that's like again with the host mentality that like you are a connector and that is what people will find that valuable. So being able to offer connections, being able to offer um, you know
Information.
information. If you talk about like a great podcast that let's say the person was into felting and I had just listened to a podcast on felting, and then keep that podcast as a follow up. So then the next day I can send them an email and be like, oh hey, here's this thing on felting that I was listening to. Um, and personalize those follow ups. So remembering having a sharing attitude, sharing information or connection, and then making sure you like use their name and keep it personal in the follow up. Other good follow ups are cards and catalogs. I'm a big fan of an onboarding process. Catalogs are great for later in the onboarding process. Let's see if I yeah, here's my onboarding process. So first you have your meeting where you meet the person. You send up a follow-up email like the next few days saying, "Oh, it was great to meet you. Here's that podcast I was thinking of." Then, if they're part of a business, you can always send a thank you card with your image on it. And then later on, you can send a catalog. The catalog's kind of like the big onboarding thing that will hopefully get them interested in your work after you've already formed a little bit of a relationship. Then you can send a follow-up email, say, "Oh, hey, did you get my catalog?" And they'll say, "Yeah, it was lovely." And then you say, "Oh, well, maybe we could do like coffee or a studio visit sometime." And they might need a little bit more onboarding before the studio visit. But if they're interested, maybe they'll say yes.
Yeah, they might need a few more meetings or. And
Yeah.
sometimes you may have needed to meet them like 2 or 3 times before you feel comfortable sending them an email.
Hmm.
Um,
Yep.
and that might just be like a personal comfort level. Um, and then on the thank you card in our connection meetup, I felt like somebody had a really great idea to make the um, handmade thank you cards. So whether it's like a quick watercolor or warm up drawing you do every day or quick
Hmm.
print or just something so that it's a little bit more memorable and they feel like you're, you know, generously giving them something, that piece of art. So I thought
Yeah.
that was a great idea.
Yeah. I think that yeah, some warm up drawings is a great thing to do. And again, like as you just said, like you might need to meet people a few times before doing this. Like I think it's important to remember patience and it's not personal. So let's say you send a follow-up email and they didn't respond, like it's not personal, right? They could just be so many things happening in their inbox. And being patient and saying just because you sent a follow-up email doesn't mean you can't send another one or send that thing card. Um,
And we've also done a thing on email and sending emails and when to send emails with Creative Lattice,
yep,
didn't we? Yeah.
yep, yeah, we have an email. I think, yeah, both Kristen Becker wrote one on cold calling galleries. So we have some email info. So catalogs and cards, great onboarding things. Here's my thing on names. I'm terrible at names and I'm pretty face blind. So I have no idea who people are when I'm introduced to them. Sometimes writing the name down right after you meet them is really good trick, and then you can review that afterwards. You can try and use their name right afterwards. Someone said using someone's name 3 times after you meet them is like sure to have you remember their name. There's also the trick of like, let's say me and Ruth go to the gallery and I forget someone's name, and then I'm like, "Oh, hey, great to see you. This is Ruth Lentz." And Ruth says, "Hey, great to meet you." And then they have to say their name back. Um, so it's sort of a little trick. Um, Another person in our meetup said that just be forward and say, "Hey, I'm Jack. I know we've met before, but well, what's your name again? And if you're forward with it, people tend to forgive it more than having that like blank stare, and the obvious like, oh, you have no idea who I am, even though we've met 3 times. So being forward, I think, is important. Um,
And I also think if you remember someone's name, you can say like, "Hi, Elizabeth, Ruth," right? I think it's fine to just state your name again, because
yeah, to be
if
forward.
you forget names, so do they. So do other people, right?
Everyone does it. Yep. Um, yeah. All right. We talked before the host mentality. So being generous is super important. Being generous with your time, resources, and it supports building a lasting connection. So, if you meet a curator and they are, curating a show on rocks, and I don't do anything with rocks, but I know, Ruth paints rocks. But Ruth does not paint rocks, but if she did, then I could be like, oh, you might really be interested in Ruth's work. Here's her website. So being those connectors and being generous, I think, is super important. We said before patience, right, Ruth?
Hmm.
So remember,
Yeah,
so yeah, go ahead.
I was just gonna say patience and not taking things personally, I think, are really big keys.
Hmm. Um, all right. So what if I'm an introvert and I am an, as we discussed earlier, we're both sort of introverts. Um, there's the I don't want to go. That's such a big one, right? Just even getting out the door. Someone at our meetup said reframing the experience. So shift your mindset from the like this is a chore that I have to go to it's an opportunity, and think about the positive outcomes. Like I might meet a really nice person, or I might connect with somebody that could offer me a show later down the line. Taking breaks to recharge is important. So remembering to be kind to yourself and give yourself permission to leave early if you feel like you just can't do it. I love to reward myself, so I usually like don't drink caffeinated coffee, but before an event, I'll drink some caffeinated coffee as like my reward, and it kind of gets me zipped up and ready to go. But you can go out afterwards for a nice meal at your favorite ramen place or whatever. Um, and then bringing friends, right, Ruth?
Hmm. Yeah, I think, if you can have someone who is maybe even a bit of a comfort to you or shares your interest or can even act like gives you the ability to act as a host where you could introduce them to other people, um, can be a good trick. They can kind of act as your wing person.
Yeah,
Um, but I think with the caveat that you don't take uh, people that you need to make feel comfortable that
yeah,
are even more awkward than you. So I feel like that, you have to watch out for that too, because you can't just take anyone, right? Because
yeah.
then they may hinder you even more.
Yeah, you need a wing person, and that person needs to also have a little bit of extrovert in them. A lot of people like this is also a complex one for some people because the people who are more extrovert, they find it easier to go without a friend. Because if they go without a friend, then they're forced to engage with new people. But if you're with a friend, if you know that you're just gonna, let's say you're with a friend who is also an introvert, you might just end up talking to the friend the whole time, and that would be lovely. And maybe that's what you need in order to get out the door. Um, but going without people, some find it easier than to engage with others.
Yeah, I think who you go with is important because sometimes if you go with a friend who's too extroverted, then and they may not be generous, they could not be generous, so then they take over the scene. So there is a caveat there that you have to make sure you are going with a generous person who will
Yep.
help you through, the wing
And
person is really important.
remember that it's a long game. So if you go to an event and you take someone and it doesn't work out, then find someone different for the next event. Like, don't beat yourself up that this was like your chance, right? There's always going to be more networking. Self-care, be kind to yourself, acknowledge that networking takes time. Focus on the quality of the networking, not the quantity. So if you can, if you make it to one show a month, that is, you're ahead of the game probably. Prioritize depth over breadth. That means, you don't have to talk to everyone in the room, but if you form a connection with one person in the room, that is good enough. Reflect on what you've done and improve. So let's say you've accomplished your goal of talking to one person, try and talk to 2 people next time. And remember that you can't do everything. So be gentle with yourself, do what you can, because there's so much FOMO going on around networking where, especially if you look on Instagram and you see all these things that people are doing, give yourself permission not to do them.
I also think it's important not to compare yourself to other people because, with social media, it's so easy. And kind of like you said, to compare yourself. But some people just happen to be really great at networking.
Yeah.
That comes really natural, and other people have to learn how to do it.
Yeah. And it's a skill, and you'll probably get better. And the older you get, you probably won't care about the times that don't work, right? Or if you go and you make a faux pas or something like, I feel like the older you get, the less you care.
I will definitely agree with that. And I also think you just gain more confidence too, the older you get. So.
All right, well, that was a quick session. Thank you so much for joining us. There's much more information. We're developing a full curriculum at creativelattice.com. And we'll see you at the next session. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.